So the first model or the first theory you had that introduced you to trade and how we explain trade with economics was the Ricardian model. And that was the comparative advantage, and then that the nations trade at a price in between their relative opportunity costs, and the nation that has a comparative advantage is the exporter. A nation that does not have the comparative advantage or has the comparative disadvantage is the importer. So that model was a gigantic breakthrough for economics, and it was really, really a huge accomplishment. But it still left a couple things lacking. And the biggest thing that it left lacking is that the Ricardian model had no prices. So I'm just going to write Ricardo. It didn't determine precisely price or quantity. We could never say how much each nation was going to export or import, and we could never say at exactly what price. We could say some range, and we could tell which nation would be exporting and which nation would be importing, but we couldn't get down to precise numbers. And of course, as economists, we want precise numbers. So this is an introduction to another way of explaining trade, and it really just goes right back to simple supply and demand diagrams. So everyone should like that. So we're just going to go price and quantity, and then price and quantity. And you have to work with two supply and demand diagrams to make this make even a remote bit of sense, but I don't think it's too bad at all. So if we have the world market for, let's say for oil, okay? So the world market for oil. And then over here, we have the USA's domestic market for oil. USA domestic oil. All right, and then we're gonna just go ahead and say I'm not even gonna label many axes on here. I'm not gonna put too many points on here, but let's just go ahead and say that here we have the demand line for oil for the world, and here we have the supply line for the world for oil. So this is the world, and when I say the world, I mean every nation in the world, and then we're going to just put not the USA. So this is excluding the USA because we have the USA over here. And then, you know what, I probably should have done that all in green, but such is life. So then we'll go over to the USA, and let's go ahead and say that here is the demand for oil in the USA, and then I just got to make sure that I'm going to make this line up nice and evenly. And so then here is, we're going to go ahead and say that this is the supply line for oil in the USA. All right, so if we start out first point A, I want to say, so we're going to do A's, this beginning. A is going to be no trade between the rest of the world and the USA. And that's, you know what, that's how it's normally represented. So I'm going to write rest of the world. Whoops, can't draw a straight line. Rest of the world, and then the USA over here. All right, so going back to yellow, we're going to have point A here. So if there's no trade, the US will consume this quantity, and I'm just going to write QA, and they will pay this price, which I'm just going to write as P of A. And you know what? This actually does become nicer if we actually have prices to talk about. So let's say that this is $5. Now in the world, we're going to also start with yellow over here. They're going to consume, can't draw straight lines to save my life, we're going to consume that quantity. So we'll call this quantity A with a hat over it, with a line over it. And then we're going to charge this price. And so that's significantly lower than the $5 here. These graphs are meant to line up, that's why I did it like this. So we're going to say that here oil is $3, and this will be like per gallon, so like you're filling up at the tank. So you can see that without trade, prices are different. Prices in the US are definitely different from prices in the rest of the world. So now let's go ahead and open up the entire thing to trade. So we're going to do point B, or all of the B stuff is with trade. So the first thing we're going to assume, and this may be a bit of a stretch, we're going to assume that the US does not affect the market for oil. So this is calling this assumption saying that the USA does not affect the market for the the USA does not affect the world market for oil is what's called assuming that the USA is a small country. And in reality, the US market does affect the world market for oil, but we're not going to get into that complexity here. So let's imagine that the USA has no effect on the world demand for oil. So we open up trade and world demand stays exactly the same. So the world price then is going to stay exactly the same. But now the rest of the world can trade with the US. So the US is going to trade with the rest of the world and get their oil cheaper. So now the US is also going to get oil at $3, just like the rest of the world was before the US opened up to trade. And the US, we'll call this supply at B, and then we'll call this demand at B. So then if the price in the US is $3, we're going to see that this will be the quantity produced. So I'm just going to write Q, and then I'll write produced. And this is the quantity of oil produced domestically. And then this over here is the quantity of oil consumed domestically, because that's the demand line. So the difference between these two, and I'm running out of room and also running out of colors, but we're going to just scroll down a little. So the difference between these two then is going to be the US imports this much oil. So you would take the value of here, so let's say this was 100, and then let's say that this was 50. So then the US would import 50 million barrels of oil if we were measuring this in millions of barrels. So the US would import 50, which is 100 minus 50 is equal to 50. So we would import 50 because that's the difference of this shortage, basically, this domestic shortage. So that's really all that I want to say about an importing nation, a nation that imports a good. You can imagine, just really, really quickly, I'm not going to do a full diagram here, and actually, you know what, I'm just going to go ahead and make a different video for backing up and doing a nation that exports. So the big takeaways here is that with two simple supply and demand diagrams, we now have a precise determination of price, both in the rest of the world, it'll be $3, and in the US, it'll also be $3. And then we have a precise determination of the quantity that the US will import. The US will import the difference between the demand line at the world price and the supply line at the world price, which in this example, just throwing out numbers, was equal to 50 units. And then, so we have a precise determination of quantity and a precise determination of price, which is just the world price. So that is why this model provides us with more information than the Ricardian model did. It's not necessarily better. It relies on some assumptions that the Ricardian model does not. But the Ricardian model also has some assumptions that this model does not have built into it. So there are just two different ways of looking at trade and kind of finding a way to wrap our heads around it and why nations trade. So with that, I'll see you in the next video.